In the early 1990s, the video game industry wasn't a playground, it was a kingdom. And that kingdom had a single, undisputed ruler, Nintendo. They controlled the stores, the developers, and the very childhoods of millions with an iron grip. If you wanted to play, you played by their rules. But then, there was Sega. We're often told Sega was just another competitor, but they were actually the ultimate corporate rebel, born from a burning desire to punch the giant in the mouth. While Nintendo was selling colorful plumbers and fairy tales, Sega was cooking up something faster, louder, and arguably more dangerous. They didn't just want a piece of the market, they wanted to disrupt the status quo until it cracked. This is the story of a company that flew too close to the sun on wings made of blast processing and blue fur. It's a tale of how a massive underdog turned the industry upside down, only to be crushed by the weight of its own ambition. When was the last time you felt a brand actually had an attitude? Before the sleek minimalism of today, Sega was a neon-soaked lightning bolt that forced the world to grow up. But as we'll find out, being the coolest kid in the room is a very expensive way to go bankrupt. To understand Sega's soul, we have to travel back way before the home consoles. Sega actually began as Service Games, a company founded to provide coin-operated amusement machines to U.S. military bases in Hawaii during the 1950s. It was a business built on ruggedness and instant gratification. By the 1960s, they merged with Rosen Enterprises in Japan, and the Sega we know today was born. This arcade heritage is crucial. Unlike Nintendo, which started with playing cards and toys, Sega's DNA was forged in the smoky, high-stakes environment of the arcade. They understood better than anyone else how to grab a player's attention in 3 seconds or less. They mastered the art of the spectacle. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, Sega dominated the floor with hits like Zaxxon and Hang On. But the arcade market was hit or miss, and the true prize lay in the living room. However, their early attempts like the SG-1000 and the Master System were overshadowed by the Nintendo Entertainment System. Sega was a giant in the arcade, but a ghost in the home. They needed a weapon to bridge that gap. They needed a machine that could bring the arcade home without compromise. They needed the Genesis. In 1988, Sega unleashed the Mega Drive, known in North America as the Genesis. It was a beast of a machine. While Nintendo's NES was still pushing 8-bit pixels, the Genesis was a 16-bit powerhouse. It looked like a piece of high-end hi-fi equipment designed to sit in a teenager's bedroom rather than a nursery. But hardware wasn't enough. They needed a mascot that didn't wear overalls. Enter Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic wasn't just a character, he was a mission statement. He was fast, he had an attitude, and he was the perfect showcase for what Sega called blast processing. Now, blast processing was mostly a clever marketing buzzword for the console's faster central processing unit clock speed, but it worked. Sega's marketing team, led by the legendary Tom Kalinske, launched the Sega Does What Nintendo campaign. It was aggressive, it was cocky, and it was brilliantly effective. For the first time in history, Nintendo was on the defensive. By the early 90s, Sega had captured over 50% of the US market. They were no longer the underdog, they were the new kings. But at the height of their power, the internal cracks were already beginning to show. While Sega of America was winning the war in the trenches, a different conflict was brewing inside their own headquarters. You see, Sega wasn't one unified company, it was a divided house. Sega of Japan, the mothership, and Sega of America, the upstart success story, were constantly at odds. The Japanese executives grew resentful of the American branch's massive success and the celebrity status of Tom Kalinske. This ego clash resulted in some of the most disastrous business decisions in gaming history. Instead of focusing on a true successor to the Genesis, the two branches began releasing expensive, confusing add-ons. First came the Sega CD, an expensive peripheral that barely had any good games. Then came the 32X, a stopgap mushroom that plugged into the Genesis to give it more power. It was a mess. Fans were confused, parents were angry about the constant costs, and developers were exhausted trying to support 3 different platforms at once. Sega was fragmenting its own audience just as a new player was entering the arena. A company named Sony was watching, taking notes on every single one of Sega's mistakes. The internal civil war was about to meet an external executioner. 1995 was the year the music stopped. Sega was preparing to launch their next true console, the Saturn, but they were terrified of the upcoming Sony PlayStation. In an act of pure desperation, during the first ever E3 conference, Sega's CEO announced that the Saturn wasn't launching in 4 months, it was launching right now. It was a shock heard round the world, but it was a catastrophe. Retailers were caught off guard and didn't have stock. Key partners like Walmart were so offended by being left out of the surprise launch that they refused to carry the console at all. Worst of all, the Saturn cost $399. Moments after Sega's announcement, Sony executive Steve Race walked on stage, said one word, $299, and walked off. It was a surgical strike. The Saturn was more expensive, harder to program for, and lacked a true Sonic game at launch. While the Saturn found some success in Japan due to its incredible 2D fighting games, it was a dead man walking in the West. Sega had burned through its prestige and its cash reserves. They had one final chance to save the company, one last dream to keep the rebel spirit alive. In 1998, Sega threw a Hail Mary pass. They ignored the failures of the Saturn and built something truly visionary, the Dreamcast. It was the first console of the 6th generation, and it was years ahead of its time. It came with a built-in modem for online play before the world even knew what online gaming was. It had a visual memory unit that put a screen in your controller. It was beautiful. The launch was a record-breaking success. The games were revolutionary. Titles like Soul Calibur, Shenmue, and Sonic Adventure showed the world what truly next-gen looked like. But the shadow of the past was too long. Sega's reputation with retailers and third-party developers was in tatters. Electronic Arts, the biggest publisher in the world, refused to support the Dreamcast. And then, the Hype Station 2 happened. Sony began marketing the PlayStation 2 as a supercomputer that could run the internet and play DVDs. People stopped buying Dreamcasts and started waiting for Sony. Despite its brilliance, the Dreamcast couldn't overcome the massive financial debt Sega had accumulated. On January 31, 2001, Sega made the announcement that broke millions of hearts. They were exiting the hardware business forever. The Rebel had finally run out of steam. Sega didn't die in 2001, it transformed. By pivoting to become a third-party software developer, Sega did the unthinkable. They began putting Sonic games on Nintendo consoles. Seeing the blue hedgehog on a GameCube was a sign that the console wars of the 90s were officially over. But the transition wasn't easy. The company struggled for years to find its identity without its own platform. Yet, through acquisitions of studios like Creative Assembly and Atlas, and the unexpected global success of the Yakuza series, now known as Like a Dragon, Sega found a new way to flourish. They moved from being the hardware rebel to a publisher of some of the most unique, deeply Japanese gaming experiences on the market. Today, Sega is more profitable than they ever were during the hardware years. They learned the hardest lesson in business, that your brand isn't defined by the plastic box you sell, but by the characters and stories you create. They survived by letting go of the ego that nearly destroyed them. The fire of the arcade spirit still burns in their modern hits, proving that while the Rebel may have laid down its arms, its soul remained untouchable. So, what is the legacy of Sega? It's easy to look at them as a failure because they stopped making consoles, but that would be a mistake. Sega is the reason the gaming industry grew up. They forced Nintendo to innovate. They paved the way for Sony's entry into the market. They brought online gaming to the masses years before it was standard. The lesson of Sega is a philosophical one. Greatness often comes from the courage to fail spectacularly. Sega was never afraid to be weird, to be loud, or to be first, even if being first meant being the first to crash. They taught us that competition is the fuel for progress. Without the Sega Genesis, the gaming world might still be stuck in a land of colorful mushrooms and simple tales. Sega gave the industry its edge. Today, we see their influence every time a game pushes a technological boundary or a marketing campaign dares to be provocative. They were the glorious rebels who burned brightly and burned out, only to find a new life in the shadows. The next time you hear that iconic Sega chant, remember that you aren't just hearing a brand name. You're hearing the echo of a revolution that changed play forever. Thank you for watching. I hope this deep dive gave you a new perspective on the strategies and the relentless mindset behind these global icons. If you enjoy deconstructing business empires and tech legends in this tech archive style, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. That way, you will never miss a new blueprint of history. For those of you ready to explore more boardroom coups and technological breakthroughs, I have handpicked 2 videos for you right here on the screen. Click one to keep watching. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.